Let's get let's get going to where we're discussing 73a, 7 lines from the top. So the Gemara is discussing a debate between Abaye and Rava about the following situation, about a case where there's a concept called, let me just do a summary. There's a concept called Edim Zomumin and Edei Hakasha. These are both false witnesses, but Edei Hakasha are where two people come and testify that Reuven killed Shimon. And then two other witnesses say, well, if two people come and say Reuven killed Shimon, then Reuven is put to death. But let's say two other witnesses come along and say, no, Reuven didn't kill Shimon. He just didn't do it. Somebody else did it, whatever. A tree fell on him. So they contradict the first witnesses. Those are called contradictory witnesses. If two witnesses contradicting two other witnesses, since they're contradicting, we don't believe either one. But if the second set of witnesses said, we're not testifying about what actually happened, we're just testifying about the witnesses themselves. We're saying the witnesses themselves could not have possibly seen Reuven kill Shimon on Monday in Japan, because on Monday at noon, they were with us in France. So they're impeaching the very credibility of the witnesses. That's called Edim Zomerman. And the Torah tells us that you do to those witnesses just like they tried to do to the defendant, to the person they accused. That's the case of Edim Zomerman. So now we had said in yesterday's daf a different dispute about that. The different dispute about that was, let's say the Reuven and Shimon came along and testified on January 1st that that this person did the following thing. And then on February 1st, the witnesses came and said Reuven and Shimon could not possibly have given that testimony because they were with us in a different place, meaning they're false witnesses. The world only discovered that they were false witnesses on February 1st. They did their initial testimony on January 1st, but the world only noticed it on February 1st. So now what do we do? So under this scenario, Abai says, so basically between January and February, they were going along. They were professional witnesses going to court every day, signing documents. People are buying houses on the basis of their testimony. They're selling cars. They're doing all these things because these were witnesses. You need witnesses to conduct business transactions. So what do we do with their testimony in between January and February? They're certainly disqualified from February 1st on. They're certainly no longer eligible witnesses. But what about from January to February? So Abai says, Lemafreya, that all their testimony going back to when they initially gave their testimony, not when they were initially disqualified, but when they gave their initial testimony, all of that from that point on is thrown out the window. That's what Abaye says. Rava says, no, so only from the moment where they were discovered to be false witnesses, from that moment on, is their testimony disqualified. That's the position of Rava. So Abaye says retroactively it's disqualified, and Rava says going backwards it's disqualified. So now we come to the following position. Now we have try to prove, even though we said yesterday the law is like Abaye in this matter, because the law is like Abaye in 6 cases throughout the Shas, the case of Yal Kagam. Now, nevertheless, you need tissue, Moshe? Right here, we got tissues with your name on it. So even though we say the law is like Abaye in the case of Yal Kagam, nevertheless, the Gemara is still discussing the matter. So we want to try and bring a proof from our Mishnah. What does our Mishnah say? Our Mishnah said the following. We're going to challenge Abaye. Abaye says that retroactively it's all okay. What about the fact that our Mishnah says, Tanan, Ganav al Pishnayim? What? Abaye says that retroactively they're disqualified. So the Mishnah says, Tanan, Ganav al Pishnayim. Let's say he robbed on the basis of 2. V'tabach umachar al piyam. And then on the basis of those same 2 witnesses, he went and slaughtered and sold the animal, which case he would have to do 5 times the amount, not just 2. V'nimtzu zomamin, and then they're discovered to be false witnesses. Mishalman esakol. Then they have to pay, under those circumstances, they have to pay 5 times the amount, not just 2, because the witnesses accused them of stealing, which would be double the payment, and then slaughtering or selling, which pushes it up to 4 or 5 times the penalty, the damages, and so then that's what they have to pay, 5 times the amount. V'nimtzu zomamin, and now those same. What do you need, Max? You got it? So here, you want to sit right next to me? Come sit right next to me, Max. Right here. Right here. Venim two Zomamin, and then they're discovered to be Adim Zomamin under those circumstances. Then we're going to say when they're discovered to be Adim Zomamin, so then Mishalman as a call. So those false witnesses have to pay the 5 times penalty. That's what they tried to do. So my lab, what's the scenario here? Isn't it a scenario Shei Idu al Geneva that first the witnesses testified that they stole the Chazru, they Idu al Tavicha, and then they come back and they testified that not only did they steal, but they also slaughtered the Huzmu al Geneva, and then they were discovered that they were false witnesses about the theft. The Chazru v'Huzmu al Tavicha, and then they were discovered that they were false witnesses about the slaughter. These Salkadaitach. And if you really want to be in the position that retroactively they're disqualified, Hani, these witnesses, Kivin did Samuel Aganeva, once they've been disqualified for the testimony that they gave about the theft, Iglai Milso Mafreya, it's retroactively become very abundantly clear the Kiyasadu Atavicha that when they testified about the slaughter, Pasunavu, they weren't kosher witnesses. And so therefore they can't have this penalty of like they tried to do because they weren't kosher witnesses at that point. So if that's the case, then my mishalman atvicha, why do they have to pay the extra penalty for slaughtering this animal? So isn't this prove that Abaye is incorrect? So Gemara says no. No. What we're talking about here is going atvicha, that they first slaughtered the animal, that they first declared false witnesses for the slaughter, and then only afterwards were they declared false witnesses for the theft. Gemara says, but still, sof kihadri mitzami aganeva. It's still not going to be effective because when they come back and were discovered that they're false witnesses about the theft, Iglai Milsa, retroactively, it's very clear that when they testified that it was slaughtered, they were not kosher witnesses. So so why they have to pay? If they're retroactively not kosher witnesses, they shouldn't have to pay for the slaughter that they did. So Gemara says, no, we're talking about a case where they gave the testimony at once. They testified straight away, this person stole it, and then he slaughtered it or sold it. And then they were discovered to be false witnesses. So since they gave the testimony all at once, so we're going to say under those circumstances, therefore the Hazama takes effect because they gave it all at once. What's the problem, Jeff? Where does it say? It says that they stole and then they slaughtered. It doesn't say it was a different day, and so that's what we're talking about. That wasn't clear, so that's what we're saying. That's the way it works. Well, according to Abaye, it wouldn't be valid. That's what they're saying. And now the Gemara says, let us say that this dispute between Abaye, who says retroactively invalidate all their testimony, and Rava, who says from here on or forward we disqualify the testimony. Let's say it's actually a dispute amongst earlier Tanaim. Why? We have a brisa that says the following: let's say 2 people come along and testify that this person stole, and then they testify that he slaughtered it. And then they're discovered to be false witnesses on the theft, the Edom Zomin on the theft. So, meaning to say, they testified that he stole it on Monday at noon, and then he slaughtered it, let's say, Tuesday at noon. And then the witnesses come and say, well, I don't know anything about when you say he slaughtered it, but I know that when you say he stole it, you couldn't have saw it on Monday at noon because you were with us at a different place on Monday at noon. So we're going to say, this says the Brisa, because we're throwing out a portion of that testimony, because the part of that he testified about Monday is disqualified, so therefore we're going to say that it's all disqualified. The whole testimony is thrown out. Even the testimony that he slaughtered, even though they're not impeaching that testimony. But let's say they just disqualify the Tuesday part where he says that where they testify we saw him slaughtering it. Then the thief has to pay the double because that testimony is still valid. And these witnesses have to pay because they're false witnesses. They tried to get him to pay an extra 3 times penalty, so they have to pay that. So Amar Rabbi Yossi, Bamedvar Mamurim, when do we say this? B'shtei Edius. When do we say this idea? Says Rabbi Yossi, when do we say that the thief still pays double and we're not going to cancel the testimony that they gave about the thievery? When do we say that? When there were two sets of witnesses. But when there was one set of witnesses, then if we throw out their testimony about the slaughter, we'll also throw out their testimony about the theft, because because a testimony which is partially disqualified is all disqualified. So the Gemara asks the question, what does it mean? What does it mean? Two sets of testimonies. That's where we would uphold the testimony on the theft, and one testimony we wouldn't. If you want to say when it says two sets of testimonies, it means two different groups of people. One testified about the slaughter, and the other one testified about the theft. And be'edus achas, and one testimony is bekat achas be'zachar zeh, and one testimony is one group of witnesses, one after the other. And Rabbi Yossi says be'edus achas bekat achas be'zachar zeh, and Rabbi Yossi is saying when it's one group of witnesses, one after the other, kimisadi agneva, that if they testify about the theft, and then they go and testify about the slaughter, kimitsami atvicha, when they are disqualified about the slaughter, edus shabatam mitzatzabat kula, bitzamu agneva. Then if they're disqualified about the slaughter, they're going to be disqualified also about the theft. Why would we say that just because they were discovering that they have to pay for the slaughter because they're false testimony, that they also would have to pay for the false testimony they gave about the theft? They weren't discovered to be false about the theft. So must be we're talking about b'shtei edius when it says in the Brisa two sets of testimony. It means be'edus achas ke'ein shtei edius. It means one testimony, one group that's like two testimonies. Where it's one group and they're testifying on two different days. But if it would be one group of witnesses at the same time, then we wouldn't say it. Then we would throw it out. And everybody's in the position that since, even though they said first the testimony and the theft and then the slaughter, since they said it tol kadei dibor, it's as though they spoke it all together. So what does it mean, tol kadei dibor kadibor dami? What does that mean? It means that if you say something and then immediately you say something else, we view it as though it's all said at the same time. And so therefore, since they said it all at the same time, therefore, if we're throwing out the testimony about the theft, about the slaughter, we'll throw out the testimony about the theft. What's this dispute here between the Rabbanan and the Rabbi Yossi? The Rabbanan say that the Rabbanan are of the position that from this point on, he's going to be disqualified. And so therefore, since from that moment he's going to become considered a false witness on the slaughter, since from that point on, he's only going to be considered an Edom Zomim on the slaughter and not the theft. Whereas Rabbi Yossi says, Rabbi Yossi says, no, it's retroactively, like Abaya. And so since immediately when he testifies, he's always going to be disqualified, that when they're discovered to be false witnesses on the slaughter, they're also false witnesses about the theft. It doesn't mean that he has to pay the money. It means that he's going to be disqualified about the testimony about the theft. That's what Rashi says. Yeah.
These examples are businesses where there's some compensation that's monetary.
Right.
Put it back together. Let's say the interim is someone's a witness on to get or someone that's executed because they.
Well,
some things can't be
right. So the basic question is: let's say it can't be exact compensation. The examples you gave are not necessarily the best examples, but the question is a very important question, and it's a very strong question. And the Gemara itself asks this question on the first daf of Makos at the bottom of the page. The Gemara says, well, you can't do exactly like they tried to do, then you give them lashes. So let's say. So the Gemara says, let's say you disqualify the person of being a witness. You said that this person is not a kosher witness. So what are you going to do to that person? So we say that we give them lashes. That's basically the point.
My question also is, there's some transaction. Let's say it's the ketubah. They were witness to this.
Right. So if they were, what are you saying? That they testified that this person was married and they weren't really married? Or you're saying we want to disqualify them as witnesses that they gave on the ksuba? What are you asking?
Let's say.
Wait, 1 second. What are you asking?
Yeah, so I mean,
right. So that's the Gemara's point from yesterday that Abaye says retroactively their testimony on the ksuba is disqualified, and Rava says that we don't say that because of the concern of the purchasers, that people who purchase on their basis, but the law is like Abaye and not like Rava. But that's the point that the Gemara said yesterday. The ksuba, if the ksuba is disqualified, you're married irrespective of a ksuba. Ksuba is just a bond; it's not valid to the marriage. But if they Adam kedushin, then their marriage would not be valid, so they'd have to remarry. If the ksuba, they would have to get a new ksuba right away, called a ksuba de irkasa. You can't stay married even for 1 day without a ksuba. Okay, so yeah, there'll be all sorts of problems. That's why before you choose your witnesses, you have to make sure that they're really strong witnesses. Otherwise, you could be having a lot of exposure. So the Gemara says, dummy. So because we're going to say that this, when you say within the time of what it was said, it's like you said it all together. So the Gemara says, dummy. The Gemara says, no, if you're going to say that, if you say something within the time it takes the same thing, everybody would say it's retroactively disqualified. Haha, but dibor dami kamiflige. No, here that's a dispute whether or not if you say something within that time, it's going to be said viewed like you said it together. Rabbanan Savri Tokate Dibor Rab Kadibor Dami. Rabbanan say if you say something within the time it takes to say something, it's not going to be like you said it together. And so therefore we're going, it's as though you said the testimony about and so therefore the testimony of the theft and the testimony of the slaughter are not one testimony, they're two separate testimonies. And so therefore, even though on testimony of the slaughter he was with their testimony is disqualified, nevertheless the testimony about the theft is not disqualified and they'll have to pay 2 on it. The Rabbi Yossi Savar on top of 73b, Tokate Dibor Kadibor Dami. It's like they said it together, and so therefore the testimony on the theft is also going to be disqualified. The Gemara says, okay, let's debate whether or not this is accurate. Does Rabbi Yossi really say Tokate Dibor is like Dibor Dami? Let's analyze this. This is a Mishnah which we had in Zvachim. If a person, now there's a law, background for this law is there's something that's prohibited from the Torah. That is that if you have a sacrificial animal, you're not allowed to exchange it. Let's say you have one bull, which was supposed to be a sacrifice, an olah on the altar. You can't take this bull and say, I'm going to switch it out for another bull. That's called the prohibition of Tamura. You're not allowed to do that. But let's say you say this bull is exchanged for this bull. You did it anyway. Then the first bull retains its holiness, and the second bull is now the same level of holiness. You're not allowed to do it, but if you do it, it takes effect. That's the verse from the Torah. So let's say you said, Harezu Tmuras Olah. This is an exchange for the Olah. Tmura Shlamim. And it's also exchanged for the Shlamim. But you didn't say also. You say it's exchange for an Olah, exchange for a Shlamim. So then Rabbi Meir says, Harezu Tmuras Olah. Different Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir's in a position, you always take the first thing the person says, not the second. Therefore, it's an exchange of an olah and not a shalom. Whereas Rabbi Yossi says, if that was his intent from the beginning, since you can't say 2 things at once, and we're going to say his words are upheld, and therefore it's both an olah and a shalom. Let's say he said it tmuras olah, and then he changed his mind and says tmuras shlamim. Change his mind. Harezu tmuras olah. Then we're going to say it's a Tmuras Olah. And we asked about that. If it changes my Pshita, then it's obvious that you can't change your mind once you consecrate something. So therefore, it means if you change his mind, even within the time it takes to say something together, and we still don't allow it. So we see from here, Rabbi Yossi does not accept this concept of if you change your mind really quickly, it's okay. The Gemara said, no. There's 2 types of this Tokadei Dibor. You're changing your mind within the, what this is like? This is like if you're playing chess and you move a piece and you want to change it really quickly. So that's why they have the touch move in chess. Once you touch it, you can't change it. But here you said something and you want to change your answer really quickly. Let's say you're playing on Jeopardy and you want to say the answer is the Yankees. But you say, I meant to say the Mets. No, would they allow it? No, they wouldn't. But so here in testimony, that's basically the issue. So the Gemara says, actually, so Tokade Dibor have Amri Tokade Dibor have. So they say really everybody says Tokade Dibor is Dibor. But there's two types of how we define what Tokade Dibor is. Chad Kadei Shelos Talmud L'Rav, V'chad Kadei Shelos Harav Talmud. So one says it's Tokade Dibor and the amount of time it takes for a student to say hello or greeting to their Rebbe, which is actually going to be, you'll see for the Gemara is longer. It's Shalom Aleichem Rebbe Umori. It's 4 words, peace upon you, my teacher, my master. And one says it's only Tokdei Dibor, the amount of time, Kadesh Elos Harav Talmud, only the amount of time it takes a Rebbe to greet a student, which is only Shalom Aleichem. So it's shorter amount. So that's what their dispute is. Kileisle Rabbi Yossi, Kileisle Rabbi Yossi, when Rabbi Yossi does not accept Tokdei Dibor, that's Kadesh Elos Talmud L'Rav. When Rabbi Yossi says the amount of time that a teacher greets a student, that a student greets a teacher is Shalom Aleichem Rabbi Mori, that he doesn't accept. That's too long. But Rabbi Yossi Shalom Aleichem Rabbi Mori, Dinafish, that's more words. It's 4 words. Talmud Shalom Aleichem Islay. But it's just the greeting of Shalom Aleichem that he does accept. Yes. Or you're asking, is it from the beginning of the second statement or the end of the second statement? I assume it's from the beginning of the second statement. That's a very precise question. I hadn't thought about it. Yeah. It's even shorter according to one or the other.
1.5 seconds versus 3 seconds.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, that's you have to measure that.
I'm just thinking if you're testifying, I'm going back to the case, if you're testifying about theft and the slaughter.
Yeah.
Right? 5 minutes to testify about the theft, and then another 5 minutes to testify.
You said I saw him on Monday. Oh, right. So it's got to be the beginning. Yeah, but it's the whole idea is you really meant to say one way. Your words just came out incorrectly.
That's I get that here. That's not the case with testimony. In that case, you're intending to testify about 2 things.
Yes.
Sequentially, like he says here, you can't say words simultaneously.
Yeah.
You seem to have slipped
No, you're asking very well. Okay. The Tosfos points out a problem with this. It says in the Gemara in Brachos, if somebody gives a greeting and one who gives a greeting and returns a greeting to his teacher causes the Shekhinah to depart from Israel. That's if you greet your Rebbe just like you greet your friend, like what's up, dude? You know what I'm saying? So and he does. So anyway, just to point out. Okay, Amarava Edom she hukchashu ubesov huzmu. Okay, so now we have a different problem. We had it was implied in the first discussion that if a witness has been disqualified, let's say you disqualify the witnesses for being false witnesses, then counterintuitively, the testimony, they can't be liable for testimony they gave, which they were declared mizimim, they can't be, because they weren't kosher witnesses at that time. So now, because the only way you could be liable for the penalties, just like you tried to do, is if you actually here, Adam, take a picture of me and Colby studying Torah. We'll be done in 5 minutes if you're bringing him home. All right, beautiful. So if you're waiting to take him home, we'll be done in 5 minutes. So the point is that, okay, so if you were declared to be a false witness, an ineligible witness, then the plot that you tried to do, that penalty can't be imposed upon you. It's only if you're a kosher witness. Now, you follow that, Harold?
Yeah.
Okay, it's just the law. It's the law.
Yeah.
Basically, you're only on the hook if you really could have carried it out. If you really could have carried out the plan. There's many other counterintuitive laws. Like it's also the Talmud says if the witnesses actually their false testimony was actually, if they tried to testify that this person did something wrong and therefore is worthy of death, then we're going to say that they were false witnesses, then we put them to death. But let's say they actually killed the person, then we wouldn't do that. then we don't punish the witnesses because it's only like they plotted to do, not like they actually did. Anyway, that's another counterintuitive law. But the point is here, let's say, we had said this at the beginning, let's say their testimony was not impeached. They weren't declared the Edom Zoman, but it was contradicted. So then their testimony would not be valid. So the plot wouldn't have been done. So, and then after their testimony was contradicted, then witnesses came and said, you're Edom Zoman. So do we still do to them like they tried to do? So now we say here, Rava says, Edom shehuchatshu, that first these witnesses were contradicted, and then afterwards, other witnesses came and said, you couldn't have given that testimony then because you were with us in Paris when you said this guy was killed in Japan, then we're going to kill them. Then we're still going to kill them. Even though at first their testimony was already contradicted, we're still going to apply the penalty of kasher zamam like you plotted to do. Why? Because every time that you have an Edom Zoman case, it's really first contradicted. It's just, it was incomplete. Meaning to say, every Edom Zoman really starts off as a case of akasha. And says Rava Menamino, how do I know this case? Titania, I'll prove you from a brisa. Let's say a person says, Mi dani beishponi. Let's say he says, I testify beishponi. Okay, another background case. Okay, there's two types of slaves in the Jewish tradition. It's not something we like to talk about, but there's going on YouTube, so I'll tell you. There's the Hebrew slave. The Hebrew slave is basically like an indentured servitude. It's not really the classic case of slavery, but then there's something called a Canaanite slave. Canaanite slave is more similar to the type of slavery that America outlawed with the Emancipation Proclamation. This type of Canaanite slave, even though he was owned by the master, he would go free if the master struck him and knocked out 24 of his limbs, one of 24 limbs. His eye and his tooth, and 22 other limbs. Okay, that's in the Torah. You had a problem with that? That's what it says. I mean, whatever. We're not proud of this, but this is something that's in the Torah, and we have to understand it, but it's there. It's called a Canaanite slave. So, but if you knock out the eye or the tooth, the slave goes free. That's the case here. So we have this case here. Midani bishploni. So the two witnesses come and they testify that Ruvain shesimas ein avdo. He blinded his servant's eye. So that means Ruvain's servant would go free. His slave would go free. Vihipil has shown sheno. And then he knocked out his tooth. So once he blinded his eye, the slave goes free. Now he knocks out his tooth. He has to pay for the tooth. And then the brisa continues, Sharei Arav Omerkin. And the master says that. V'nimtzu zomim, and now these witnesses are discovered to be false witnesses. Mishalmand may ayin le'eved. They pay the value of the eye to the slave. This doesn't make any sense. If they're discovered to be false witnesses, the Gemara is going to say they should pay the value of the slave to the master because they were accusing him of something which we would have lost it. So the Gemara says, hey, it doesn't make sense. If this price is just so let's be understood literally, that it's really exactly as we said, and there's no other case. Mishalman may ayin le'eved. Why would you pay the value of the eye to the slave? If the slave goes free, why would you have to pay him the value of the eye? And second of all, they should have to pay the value of the whole slave to the master because they were trying to make this false testimony to cost the master something. And third problem is, the master says this, the master doesn't like this. You were trying to cost the master a lot of money. So therefore, Rav is saying, Rava must say, Elav, that what's the scenario here? The whole scenario must be here, Kagon, the Asube trade. So we have to, the Gemara is saying that Rava would explain that this price is that there's actually a second set of witnesses, that this is what's going on. There's actually three sets of witnesses. So the first two witnesses come and they say, they say that the master knocked out his tooth and then knocked out his eye. That first, since he first knocked out his tooth, he goes free, and now he knocks out his eye. They have to pay the slave the value of the eye because the slave already went free. And then a second group of witnesses come and they say and they say he knocked out his eye, and then his tooth, so he has to pay the value of the tooth. To go buy they only have to pay the value of the tooth, which is much less than the value of an eye, because everybody would rather lose a tooth than an eye. That the first one, that the middle ones are contradicting the first one. The first one said first he knocked out his tooth and then his eye, and the second one said he knocked out his eye and then his tooth. Vahainu Sharei Rav Omer Kane, and they say that the master likes this. Why? Because the master prefers to pay for a tooth than an eye. The Nikolay b'Maidika Amri Vikatani, and then we say v'Nimtzu Zomamin, and now this that they are discovered the Zomamin v'Nimtzu Zoman Mitziai. So then the second group is found to be false witnesses, meaning to say when they said that he knocked out his eye and then his tooth, that was Edim Zomamin. So therefore, their whole testimony is thrown out. Mishalman. So therefore, what do they try to get him to do? They tried him to get paid for the value of an eye, when really only had to pay for the value of a tooth. So therefore, Mishalman Tmei Ayin La'Eved. They have to pay the value of the eye to the slave, because that's what they try to force him. Shema Mino. So we see from here, even though they contradicted him, they're still going to be discovered to be false. They're still capable of be calling Eidei Zomim. And so that's a proof for Rava's statement that even though you're contradicting, you could still be discovered to be false witnesses. Yeah, I want to just say before we stop here that that this is very technical, but this is the whole idea of what's the core concept here is if a person does something wrong, when do we start looking at them as they're being having done something wrong? When they're discovered to have done something wrong, or when they first actually did it? So that's the core question here. All right, if anybody has any questions, we'll pick this up, and I'd like to encourage everybody to come.